Collins & Co invite you to join us for our regular lunchtime not-for-profit seminars and workshops. In these sessions, guest speakers deliver expert knowledge on topics specifically catered for the not-for-profit sector. Sessions are held at Collins & Co from 12 till 2 and lunch is provided. Contact Collins & Co to find out the next seminar topic and to register.
Hi, my name's Simon Oats, storyteller. Today I'm presenting on the science and art of storytelling, the amazing cutting-edge research that's come out of neuroscience and psychology about what storytelling is and how you can harness the power of it to convince people to take the actions that you need them to take to change the world for the better.
He can do that for himself, but I'm just going to introduce him. So, Simon Oats.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks. Well, good midday, moving into afternoon. Yes, my name's Simon. I work predominantly in the non-profit sector these days, working with story, but I do come from a background as a performance storyteller, which is how I learnt the power of story. So that's where I'd like to start, actually. I'd like to tell you a story, if that's all right. In my experience, most of the time that's all right, which is one of the powers of story. So I want to tell you about an experience I had when I took a storytelling piece that I had worked on for a couple of years over to the Adelaide Festival to perform. And this was in 2008. It's a piece called Orpheus in the Underworld, which, if any of you know your Greek myth, is an ancient story about a musician whose lover dies and he can't bear this, so he goes down to the underworld to get her back from the gods of death. And I tell this in a 1-hour epic storytelling with an electric guitar through 11 songs and playing lots of different characters. Real kind of old school performance storytelling, but with a very modern twist. So I'd gone on over to Adelaide. I had a venue which had a nice cabaret feel. We had, tables. There was a bar at the back. And I think it was about the third night into the season, so I'm starting to get used to the venue, but it's still quite a nerve-wracking thing to be just you and a guitar with an audience as your responsibility for an hour. So the first song, normally I'm kind of getting settled as I warm up the crowd, and that's where I was halfway through the first song that opens the piece when I heard this loud voice from somewhere in the middle of the venue go, "You grab a table! I'm just going to get a beer." I looked up in time to see this large, hairy fella turning around, and on the back of his jacket were the words, "Hell's Angels." So, let's get back about 2 nights before. I'm staying with my cousin Adam in Adelaide, and he manages baggage handling, or did at the time, for Virgin, and he'd been telling me stories about the Hells Angels and how they ran organised crime in Adelaide. He told me a fabulous graphic story about the rumble he'd witnessed at the airport between the Hells Angels and another rival motorcycle gang who'd got off 2 different flights and met in the concourse and gone at it hammer and tongs. And his particular favourite part of the story was how the police arrived and hung back at the sides, not wanting to get involved until it was all over, and the only action he saw a member of the constabulary taking was to go and pick up a pair of thongs that had been left behind and gently put them in the bin before he went off. So all of these images of the Hells Angels flood my mind as I see my friend turn around there. He goes and gets his beer, sits down next to his woman at the table just in front of me here. I continue with the show. Meanwhile, I'm starting to think, this is the night I'm going to die on stage. This guy's going to hate this show. He's going to think I'm a namby-pamby artsy ponce. He's going to pick up that beer bottle once it's empty, throw it right at my head. And I'm really sweating with a bit of extra terror rather than just the performance anxiety. And through the first part of the show, he's talking away to his woman there, and I can't hear what he's saying, but it's pretty audible, and you can feel that everyone in the room knows that he's talking away. My assumption is that this is all about, when can we leave? Who is this bastard? Why'd you make me come here? But about halfway through the show, the chatter stopped. And every time I looked over, I noticed that he was eyes pinned on me. Okay, so something's going right here. Near the end of the show, there's a climax point where I turn out from the story, because this is one of the great things you can do with storytelling, and I just ask a few questions of the audience. And the first one that I ask is, have you ever sabotaged a love affair? No one ever answers the question, except tonight I get a nice loud and clear, yep. It's my Hell's Angel here. So I ask him the next question, have you ever deliberately hurt your lover? He went, oh yeah. So, that's okay, that's fine. I finish out the story. Show's over. I head straight out to the bar because I really need a drink after that one. And I'm just starting my beer when across the room, straight towards me comes the Hell's Angel. He comes straight up, he says, mate, I never go to theatre, I can't stand that shit, but I loved your show. And I said to my missus, this bloke knows what it means to love a woman. So we had a big chat. We had a long chat about relationships and love and loss and all the deep stuff of life, and him and his wife as well, and that was great. Big connection. At the end of the conversation, he said to me, "Well, I'm going to tell all my mates to come and see your show," which fortunately either he didn't or they didn't listen. And off he went, and we parted ways. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because to me, storytelling is fundamentally about connection. It's about how human beings connect deeply on an emotional level, on a values level. And if you had said to me that I would have a conversation before that experience with a Hell's Angel about love, loss, and the human experience, I would have thought you were crazy. But this is the deep power of story in my mind, is that it has the power to create bridges over massive cultural divides. And normally in our communications we focus on target audience and who we're speaking to, you know, people who are easy to get on side. But one of the great things about story, you aim your story at your target audience, but it can reach so far beyond that when you find a powerful audience, a powerful story. So, what I want to do with you today is take you through the science and art of effective storytelling. About 5 years ago, I came across a body of work that has emerged predominantly from the US that looks at what neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and about 15 fields of science can tell us about the nature of story, and in particular, how it functions in the mind of the listener. This stuff, for my mind, is gold, because we talk about story all the time, but it's a very amorphous thing. And in my experience, we'll do a little experiment. Very few people can actually define what a story is. So what have you got for me? If I ask you to define story, what can you tell me about what is a story?
I think it's generally, say in film or theatre, it tends to be structured as a beginning, middle and end. So a 3-act structure.
Yep.
That really takes you on an emotional journey.
Yes, a structure that takes you on an emotional journey. That's a really cool part of it. Yeah.
To me, storytelling is information that normally involves a person or people, something a bit personal. I think that's what we all seem to be interested in, and described in a way that we can easily follow, and it becomes memorable.
It becomes memorable. So there's some really key points in there. Firstly, it's about personal people. Information is being communicated, but memorable. Memory is a key part of what the science tells us about the nature of story. Anything else that anyone wants to throw in the mix? Yeah.
Often the stories that are most popular are often the ones that follow the journey, someone's journey, like a hero.
Yes, a journey from one place to another.
Yeah.
Often a journey of transformation is in there. Yeah.
I read a lot to my young kids, and I'd say the ones that are successful with them and the ones that I remember are ones that invoke some sort of emotional response.
Yes.
So whether they identify with the character or they don't like the character, or at the end they think this is a happy ending or a bad ending or whatever it is. So that was a good story or that was a bad story. So, because if you don't in some way connect, you've forgotten it the next day.
Yep.
And
Right.
it's something that probably you want other people to tell. I mean, I'm sure there's people here
To
today that
retell.
will now go and tell your story,
Well, I would imagine that on a basic level now, at least within the next 24 hours, all of you could retell the story I told you. It's lodged in memory enough that you would be able to retell it. Whereas if I put up a graph of a set of data points, unless it fits straight into information you were currently looking for and was really hot, most of you would not be able to recall those data points with accuracy. I think there's a few things I'd like. The emotion, again, is very important. The emotion that you're left with at the end, that's a really critical part of what the science tells us about storytelling, particularly what I call effective storytelling, where you are looking for a particular effect on the audience. It's all very well to tell a wonderful story, but if it doesn't encourage people to take the action you need them to take, what's the point? Right? So effective storytelling is storytelling that is designed to elicit a particular and specific behaviour from a target group. And the other thing that's under there that I like to talk about, particularly when people are working on a story, is telling it to children. The Orpheus story that I tell is an adult's piece of storytelling. I designed it for an adult audience, but I've had 4-year-olds in the audience. I don't dumb down the language, but they will be gripped for an hour. Why? Because story is fundamental. I think it's one of the best acid tests that you have if you're getting into storytelling from an organisational point of view. Take your story and tell it to a child. If the child understands it and at the end doesn't say something like, "Was that it?" or "Is that the end?" then you have a story on your hands. Because a lot of what I see out there in the communication space that is called story is not actually a story. And you'll see why as we go in and define it. So I came across this just the other day. Ben Rattray, the founder of Change.org, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Change.org work on petitions on the internet, right? Incredibly successful campaigns. Here's what he said: humans are the sort of creatures who access issues not through abstract ideas or numbers, but through the lens of personal narratives. And what Change.org does, we enable people to tell the kind of stories that mobilise the size of the populations that are required to move issues. And I love this bit. This was a new one for me. People aren't acting out of a sense of charity, they are acting out of a sense of solidarity. This is really important because it's very different, and solidarity speaks to empathy. So the feel of solidarity is we're acting with someone who we feel with, who we identify with. That's a very different action to going, "Oh, you poor person, I have pity and I will act," out of a sense of charity. Storytelling is all about that solidarity. Identity is a very important part of it. Identity and empathy. Okay, so what is story? I want to feed these questions in. Why is it that every human culture in history has had storytelling as a central activity? There are human cultures that never invented the wheel, but there are no human cultures that we know of that do not tell stories.
Well, the transmission of knowledge through time without written language, I would think.
Yes, but why story in particular? There are other ways, so we'll go on. Why is it that a 3-year-old child can retell a simple story before their their cognition is sophisticated enough to recall a list of instructions? I have a 4-year-old, and if you say to him, "Go into your bedroom, get your pajamas, bring them out here and put them on," he will go into the bedroom, and then eventually you're going to have to go after him because the rest has been forgotten, right? He can't retain it, not yet. However, he can tell you the 3 little pigs, which I would argue is an infinitely more complex structure to remember. And why is it that we adults, they estimate, spend over 75% of our leisure time in story-based activities? We are actively seeking out stories all the time. This is one of the bits of gold for communication, is when you structure something as a story, you are giving it to me in a structure that I crave, that I want. I don't want your advertisement, I don't want your fundraising newsletter, but if there's a story in it, I want the story, because I want stories all the time. So, let's see if my little mouse is going to work from here. I want to show you one of the simplest animations ever made. I just want you to have a look at it. Take a look. see what you see in there. Oh, hello, good. And no, right.
There's a play button bottom left.
There was a play button, was
Is there
there?
a play or is it just a play?
Where'd it go? Ah, here we go. This is really interesting, controlling this mouth. Just watch this. We'll talk about it afterwards. That's it. What did you see?
A selfish game. Triangle in box is a liberated triangle with a circle. Triangle wants to grab circle and own circle. Fight ensues, and eventually the original triangle and circle managed to escape this thing.
Okay, awesome. Other things that people saw?
The human drama, a fairly common human drama around bullying, like actually sort of bit of bullying or some sort of schoolyard dynamics as well, with the way that friends will support each other or
Yeah.
group up to obtain support.
As you said bullying, I saw a few other heads nodding. Can we see a show of hands? We saw something along the lines of bullying. Okay, great. Did anyone see anything different to bullying?
I thought it was playful.
As playful, like I've had before a game of Tiggy or something like that, that it's a game between kids or...
Yeah, completely
Okay.
random.
Completely random. Okay.
For some reason, I was thinking that the circle was food and survive. It was more survival.
Okay.
My brain doesn't go to bullying. It was like this. They needed the circle to survive. I don't know. That was what I thought.
Okay, so you had kind of two characters
Yeah.
and
It's
a
like
commodity
freaky,
that
straight
they're
away
fighting
go to
over.
that. Yeah.
Wow, cool. Okay. That's great. I love it when I get an original one. Because I've shown this many, many times, heard many responses, but that is the first time. Great.
Okay.
Awesome. Anything else?
I think I saw territory and fear of invasion, and then I have to say the ground circle looked feminine to me.
Yep.
The two triangles look male fighting, and then just getting around, and then she's escaped in there probably for protection. And then oh my God, I'm caught. Then the aggressive one comes back and says and then the other one comes and rescues. And then he's very angry when they've gone. So,
Wow,
So
great.
it's domestic violence.
Probably.
I often get domestic violence, bullying.
Territory.
Is anyone sitting here going, what are you guys on about? I just saw a bunch of shapes moving around the screen. Did anyone have that response? Because occasionally people do.
Yes, I did get the bullying sort of aspect of it, but I was actually interested in the shapes, and I thought that the two triangles being of like shape, of like mind, would somehow end up together in this scenario, whereas ostracising the circle, which was of a different character. So
Yeah.
so I saw a bit of that,
Okay.
but they didn't obviously end up.
Intergeometric relationships going on there. So this is an experiment designed by two psychologists, Hyder and Simmel. They showed this in the 1940s to a group of 114 participants. Out of that group, 3 people reported that they saw just geometric shapes moving around a blank screen. Everyone else saw stories. Now it's interesting in particular that people come up with different stories here, and that's partly because we have some pretty basic information. But what I've heard back from you in terms of what you saw includes character, intentions of character, emotions, I love the fact that you had even inferred thinking and dialogue. All of this is stuff that you guys are bringing to this experience. Now, my question is, sometimes it can take a little while to click in and go, what's going on here? But once it clicks in and you're reading it as a story, does that feel like work to do it? Or does it feel like it's naturally unfolding in your mind?
It feels very natural.
Yeah. So this is really critical, because here's what the science tells us about the nature of what story actually is. It turns out that story is not fundamentally the thing that we tell or share with other people. It is one of the primary structures of human cognition, and we're doing it all the time. So the theory is that story is the primary way in which we select from the stimulus we're bombarded with all the time for what is relevant information in order to embed it into memory. It's the structure of cognition that we use to create memory. And we will look at what that structure is as we go along. But we are talking about people, emotions, intentions, goals, obstacles that have to be overcome. The things that you would recognize from a movie, from a kid's book, from an exciting story that someone tells you socially.
So can I just ask, are you suggesting that in story format that it becomes more memorable if something...
Yes, and in fact some of the scientists suggest that it's not just that it becomes more memorable, but that the brain has to put stimulus, incoming stimulus, into story form in order for it to come forward into conscious thought. We don't even recognize something is going on unless we have storied it.
Is that why we don't talk in bullet points?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about a meeting this morning where I was explaining stuff, and it wasn't. There's a lot of dialogue around the actual explanation to flesh it out. Yeah.
I like that. So here's one of the anthropological theories that I love, because it helps us to understand what story is doing for us and why we have this structure. So the idea is that at some point in our evolution we develop this story form as a structure of cognition. What does it do for us? Why do we develop this? So if you picture our distant ancestor sitting outside his cave, it's autumn time, there's autumn leaves falling from the trees, and in his memory he looks at this and he connects, he thinks, when this was happening, these leaves falling last year, there was that big tree down by the river that had those beautiful red fruits on it. I'm hungry, I have a goal to feed my hunger, I'm going to go and get those fruits. He then uses the memory structure that he's embedded to recall the pathway down to the river, which includes remembering to give a bit of a wide berth to the big cave with the bear in it. Gets down to the river, eats the fruit, goal achieved. He survives, he lives on to pass on his DNA. That structure, they say, is precisely what we use to be able to plan for goals that are 5 years into the future. Very abstract goals. All animals have goal-related behaviour. What defines humans is that we are able to relate to goals which are not in our immediate environment. And that's how we use this structure of story. Now, the secondary thing that they say is that at a certain point, some anthropologists are now suggesting, and this is what I was flagging for you before, Tim. Some anthropologists are now suggesting that in fact we developed language in order to externalize the story form. Why? So that we could share memories. And now this is a massive evolutionary advantage. It helps our offspring and our cohort in our tribe to be able to plan to undertake behaviours based on mistakes or rewards that they haven't experienced, right? So how does that work? Let's take Ugg, and he's got his son Ugg Jr. with him, and they're going off for a day in the forest. It's Ugg Jr.'s first hunting experience. He's really juiced. He cannot wait. He's got his own little spear. He's going out with Dad. Awesome. They're walking through the forest, and as they go, Ugg notices the red spotted poisonous toadstool, and he thinks, oh, I better let him know about them. So he says, see that, son? Poison. Don't eat it. Will Ugg Jr. remember this? It's a big day. He's going to go hunting. That's going to pretty much obliterate everything else from his memory. So there's another thing that Ugg Sr. can do. See that toadstool? Yes, Dad. Your Uncle Matt ate one of them once. Uncle Matt? I don't have an Uncle Matt. Yeah, I'm getting to that. Uncle Matt brought one of them home and he made a soup and he cooked it up and he ate it. And about 30 minutes later he started to twitch and his eyeballs started to bulge and they went red, and then there was foam coming out of his mouth and he vomited blood everywhere and he fell on the floor and he twitched and he died. Don't eat that. You get it? This is the theory. Okay, so all of this speaks to the fact that the most important thing that I want you to take away today is that the story you tell is not the important story. The story I make up in my mind listening to what you tell, that's the important story. So, yeah, let's have a little play with this. We often skip over this, that fundamentally story is about sharing a memory structure. It's about sharing memories. And this is an amazing thing that we can do through language. We're not going to use a story structure at the moment. I just want you to have a little experiment with the simple step of sharing a memory. So I'll ask you all just to picture in your mind someone significant to you. Perhaps someone from your childhood, grandparent, maybe a parent. Someone who you feel really positively towards would be best for this exercise. And what I'm going to ask you to do is share with your partner images of that person, not facts. I don't want you to tell that your grandfather was a World War II pilot or that he grew up in Frankston. None of that stuff, not information. I mean, he always wore a mustard yellow cardigan that had a missing button. He smelled like Sard's Wonder Soap. He used to say, you know, one of the classic things, details, little things, so that in my mind I can picture, I can hear the sound of their voice or what they said, I can smell him. I want you to bring something to life. That's a memory, right? So, how many people have we got? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Perfect. Can you turn to a partner, please? Just the person next to you. Does anyone... Actually, can you guys partner up? Stuart, are you happy to do this? And then we're good? Okay. One person put up their hand from each partnership. One person put up their hand. I need a hand up from one partner. Okay. The other person goes first. I'll give you 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes and then I'll let you know. Get straight into it. Go. Only 2 minutes. Okay, and just bring that to a close for a moment. Thank you. What I want to do now is just give the partner who listened 30 seconds to tell back any details or particular images that really stuck in your mind. The ones that made you go, ooh, or gave you a little tingle, or, you know, went, oh, yeah. Okay, just 30 seconds. Ready? Go. Yeah. And just finish up there. Just finish up there. Okay. Cool. Now we're going to swap over. 2 minutes for the other person to share a memory of their special someone. Okay, ready? Take it away. Hey, you always want to hear the rest of the story. I know it's very cruel to make you stop. 30 seconds for the partner to report back the things that really stuck in your mind or, you know, made your heart quiver. Go for it. 30 seconds. So just before we move on, I'd just like to hear if anyone has a particularly kind of juicy detail, just one, like just one, not the whole description, one particular image that stuck in your mind from what your partner told you. Just I'd love to hear a few of them.
Yes, a grandmother who lost her sight but could still go into the forest and find plants and herbs by feel.
Wow. Cool.
The Tab soft drink, that which I haven't. It's such a remnant of the past that that was integral to the story for me. Put me in a particular time frame.
Yeah, isn't that amazing, that ability of details to do that? Tab soft drink. This is about, I'm always talking about when I'm coaching people on story, more specific, get more specific. He had a soft drink. Yeah. He had a Tab soft drink. That does something very different. Maybe one more?
It's an observation that my partner made on my grandmother that I'd never noticed before, and that she was always very softly spoken, and she was from Ireland. And my partner here said, well, that's probably because she had to share secrets during British occupation. And it was like, that would be true, she was in Northern Ireland, but it's something I'd never even thought of. So.
Wow. There you go, that's kind of expanding a detail. Okay, and it's emotional too. Have you noticed? The things that stick are generally emotional. So, speaking of emotion, I want to show you something from the work of Paul Zak. Now, Paul Zak is a neuroeconomist. I'm not sure there's many neuroeconomists around, but what he primarily studies is the neurochemistry of empathy. And he's written an amazing book called The Moral Molecule, about oxytocin and its relationship to empathy, altruism, these kinds of things. Paul Zak studies empathy by looking at oxytocin release, and there's three ways that he has found that three pathways to trigger oxytocin release in his work. The first is that there's a synthetic oxytocin spray that can go up the nose, and it releases oxytocin, and people have empathic feelings. The second is hugs. They call him, I think, Professor Hug or Dr. Hug, because when you go into his lab, he offers you a hug. And the third way is that he shares emotional stories. And this is from a piece of research of his where they did just that. It focuses on an experiment in which they shared a story, which is a true story. It's the story of a boy by the name of Big Ben Bowen, who died quite young. He had a terminal illness. He had brain cancer, and the story is about his... So there's a bit of a trigger warning, I guess, there. But what it very quickly gets into is the fascinating study that they did around people's responses and what happens on a neurochemical level when people are viewing and responding to a story such as this. So...
I want to tell you a story about a little boy named Ben. Ben is 2.5 years old, and Ben has brain cancer. And Ben's really happy. He's happy because he's been through 2 rounds of chemo and radiation, and he feels good for once. He doesn't feel yucky, and his father's enjoying seeing Ben's happiness. But as the father tells the story of Ben and his cancer, the father's voice begins to break. And he says, it's very difficult to play with Ben because Ben thinks everything is wonderful, but I know something that Ben doesn't, that Ben's dying. And he talks about how difficult it is to play with Ben, knowing that in 3 or 6 months, Ben will be dead. And yet Ben is so happy, he's so beautiful. And so the father tries as hard as he can to enjoy Ben, to be joyful around Ben. But then he says in the middle of this short story that it's an amazing thing to know how little time one has left. And as he says that statement, he has merged himself with his son. It's as if the father himself is dying. So in my laboratory, we've studied this story extensively. And what we found is that 2 primary emotions were elicited. One is distress, and the other is empathy. At the same time, when we asked people what they felt after the story was over, we really couldn't get very clear answers. So we began doing other studies on this story. So we took blood before and after, and we found that the brain produced 2 interesting chemicals. One is called cortisol, which focuses our attention on something important. So cortisol correlated with our sense of distress. So the more distress you felt, the more cortisol you released, and the more you paid attention to that stimulus. The second chemical release is called oxytocin, which is associated with care and connection and empathy, and oxytocin was correlated with people's sense of empathy, and the more oxytocin they released, the more empathic they felt towards Ben and his father. Now, we did something different after this experiment. We gave individuals a chance to share money with a stranger in the lab. And indeed, those who produced both cortisol and oxytocin were more likely to donate money generously to a stranger they couldn't see in the lab. In another experiment, we gave individuals a chance to donate money to a charity that works with children who are ill. And indeed, those who released oxytocin and cortisol donated money to this charity. And in fact, the amount of oxytocin release predicted in both cases how much money people would share with a stranger or with charity. What we're seeing is that this narrative is changing behavior by changing our brain chemistry. So we decided to go a little further and ask, could we actually predict before they watched the video who would donate money to charity? So with funding from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, we reran the study in which we not only took blood, but now we measured heart rate and skin conductance and respiration. And using these additional measures, we were able to identify this distress response and this empathic response, and we could predict with 80% accuracy who would donate money to charity. These individuals get paid about $20 to be in the experiment, and the people who donated money on average donated half their earnings. So we began to investigate this story further. We used functional brain imaging to identify the regions in the brain that were most active while watching that video compared to a control video in which Ben and his father were at the zoo. And what we found was that the most active areas for the emotional story were areas in the brain associated with theory of mind or understanding of what others are doing, and areas that are rich in oxytocin receptors that make us feel empathy. And guess what happens when you watch 100 seconds of a father and son at the zoo? Nothing happens and people just blank out. There's no reason for them to attend to this information because nothing's happening. There's nothing exciting. It's important to understand that.
So, I stop it there because he goes on to talk about an old theory of story structure, which is really no longer as relevant as the information we're about to get to. There's a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to in that. The first is the nature of the relationship between cortisol release and oxytocin release, distress and empathy. That is at the core of how good storytelling functions. Stories release oxytocin and they release emotional response through first engaging distress. So one of the things that I've heard said about great storytellers is that great storytellers understand that their job is to make their audience suffer. That is the primary job. You cannot get me engaged and empathizing with a character in your story unless I am suffering along with them. Empathy, compassion, suffering with. We'll look at that in more detail. The other thing is that DARPA, who came up, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, they have been funding a lot of work in the field of research into storytelling. And we're going to look at another fellow whose work they've funded, and I'll talk to you about why then. So here's some information that's come out of further research in which they've put people under fMRI scans to map the regions of the brain that are activating. When you put someone under the scan and you give them information-based material, messaging that's really about data or information, essentially you get two primary areas of the brain lighting up. Broca's area is to do with language processing, Wernicke's area to do with language comprehension. It's the part of the brain that's going, yeah, I get it, I get what you mean, I understand.
So the forebrain's on the left in this picture? The front
yes,
of the brain's
yes.
on the left?
Is on your left.
My left.
Yeah. Okay, here's what we get when we get an emotional story. You've got the language comprehension areas again. You've got the core activity in the brain in the hypothalamus, the release of cortisol and oxytocin, which, as we've seen from Paul Zach's work, is where they see that it's changing behavior by changing brain chemistry. That's happening at the center of the brain because motivation, behavioral motivation, is happening in the center of the brain, in the old brain, which is the reptilian mammalian brain, right? Not in the kind of more advanced, rationalized parts of the human brain. But here's the other thing, and this is really critical, and this is to do with our sharing memory and how we were looking at detail. To get this effect, in good storytelling, you are lighting up the whole of the sensory cortex, right? The sensory cortex is where we process action, smell, sound, sight. What's fascinating about this is that when I tell you a story that activates those parts of the brain, it is the exact same parts of the brain activating as if you were experiencing that yourself. So if I tell you about a story where I'm running down the road and I bring it to life and you imagine it, the same part of your brain lights up as if you were running down a road. Right? If I describe my grandfather's cardigan in detail, the same part of the brain lights up as if you were there seeing it firsthand. This is really critical about the nature of story and how it shares memory. It is the sharing of an experience. I can make you experience and feel something from my memory or something from my imagination. Right? When I tell it with detail and when I have a structure that is activating your desire to identify and empathize. Really powerful. So the key thing you need to know also is you don't get this behavior changing activity in the center of the brain unless you get what we call the transportation effect, where I feel like I am in the world that you are painting for me. That is where I see storytelling going wrong in the organizational sector all the time. People give you vague biographical overviews in conceptual language without detail. And this is what I think leads to, people will often ask me about compassion fatigue around sharing stories. They say, oh, what about compassion fatigue? Everyone's heard the sob stories. And I say, there's no such thing. There's only bad storytelling. If you tell me a poorly told story where I don't get to imagine it, then I don't feel empathy. And I'm annoyed at you for bothering me, right? Because if there was such a thing as compassion fatigue, we would sit down and only ever watch one episode of Netflix, and at the end of it, we'd be exhausted. I'd go, okay, that's enough empathy for one night. Jesus, can we just have a drink now? As opposed to going, I really have to go to bed because I got work tomorrow. God, just maybe one more episode, right? That's what we're doing when we're engaging in story, is empathizing, is being compassionate, feeling with someone. That's what we love. There's no such thing as compassion fatigue. Okay. DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, have funded this work, which is by a fellow by the name of Kendall Haven. This is a 4-year-long intensive research project he's done on the nature of story structure and how it influences behaviour in labs, testing for neurochemistry, testing fMRIs, minutely adjusting the structures of stories to see how it affects empathy and how it prompts behaviour. And this is what they've come out with at the other end, the story influence occasion. Almost useless for us because you would need a complex lab to implement, but it's instructive. The first thing is, story is quantifiable. Right? Classically, we think of it as a kind of healy-feely, soft, fuzzy thing. But actually what they are finding is that the behavioural outcomes of certain narratives on particular groups are predictable. Why is the Defence Association funding this? Because of radicalisation, because of narratives coming out of terrorist cells. They want to be able to test them and look at the potential of those stories to radicalise, in particular, young men. And this is what they've found, that this structure is very effective. What's interesting for us, as people who are also looking to influence behaviour, but I would suggest in a more positive light, given who's in the room, is that there's a few key things about this. That at the core of storytelling, effective storytelling, we have this. Okay, so let's have a basic look at it. IP, the influence potential, right? How likely is it to get someone to do what you're wanting them to do? Is a factor of the residual resolution emotion, how they feel at the end of the story. That's all that means. How do I feel at the end of the story as your listener? Times by the difference between the strength of audience empathy with the identity character. The identity character is the hero of the story, for lack of a better word. I like the word protagonist That's a theatrical word for it. Essentially, the person who goes through the journey of the story, the one who I identify and empathize with. If I identify really, really strongly with them, the story is going to have a bigger emotional impact on me. But what is also critical is the strength of audience antipathy to the faux character. Okay, the faux character is the big problem or obstacle that our protagonist, our hero, is up against. If I hate that thing, for example, if I hate the cancer that is taking Ben's life and the impact it's having on the family, if that gets me really emotionally charged, then the impact of the emotion I feel at the end is more likely to influence my behaviour. Why is this useful for us? Is because these things and the structure I'm going to show you help us to look at the stories we're telling, to analyse from the stories that we get and we can choose from, which one of them is most likely going to affect our audience in the way that we want them to be effective. And which parts of the story do we tell? Which parts do we emphasise? Right? This sits at the core of them. Stories can be very slippery things when you're telling them, oh, which bit do we do, which bit do we edit out, right? This and the 5-element story structure that I'm going to share with you are really critical for helping us to craft stories, to cut out the bits we don't need and to emphasise the bits we do. So here we go. This is an adaptation of Kendall Haven's work, who developed the influence potential equation. He talks about the 8 elements of story. I think it's a bit cumbersome. It's a bit hard to use. I've boiled it down to 5. Let's go through them. Element number 1 is the protagonist. Now there's a couple of things we need to know about this. Stories are about an individual. You cannot tell a story about an organisation. The board decided that we needed to, no. You need to choose the individual who I can empathise with, who is going to head up this story. We need to identify and empathise with them. They're the point of view character. And critically, as audience, we feel what the protagonist feels. That's how the emotion in the story translates. One of the things that's important about understanding how the protagonist affects the audience is that in many stories that you tell, there is a choice of who will be the protagonist of the story. Take the Big Ben Bowen story. You could choose to tell that with Ben as the protagonist, but in that telling he's not. Who's the protagonist? The father. Why is it more effective? Because the audience you're talking with for a story like this is more likely to be an adult audience. And the complexity of the story, the real struggle of the story, Ben doesn't struggle in that story. You know, the father makes that poignant statement about he doesn't know what I know, that he's dying. It's the father who's in real pain, who's struggling. Which brings us to element 2. Stories are about people struggling to overcome obstacles in order to reach goals. A classic error in leadership storytelling that I see from CEOs is they get up and tell a personal story in which everything happens as a triumph and it shows them in a very good light. And you watch the audience, because I often watch the audience rather than the storyteller, and you'll see this. Because I don't care. I don't care how well things went for you. Sorry, I do when I know you've had to struggle to get to the point where they went well. Then I'm really rooting for you, right? But we connect with others through our struggles, through suffering with, which is what compassion and empathy both mean at their root, suffering with. This is why we empathise deeply with characters. So the gold star of this goes to J.K. Rowling for the Harry Potter series, which if you've seen the films or read the books, Harry Potter has such a hard, bloody time. Think about this. He's an orphan. His parents were killed by the most powerful and evil wizard in existence. He's then farmed out to his uncle and aunt who hate him and keep him under the stairs with the spiders, spoil his cousin while giving him a smelly sock for his birthday if he gets that. Everything goes wrong for Harry. And critically, Harry mostly doesn't complain about that. He would be quite within his rights to go, you know what, I'm 12. you guys bloody sort this out. I'm going to go and play. But he never does. He struggles nobly to overcome unfair odds, and that is empathy gold. This is really critical too, because stories about victims don't work very well either. If you have a story about a beneficiary of your organisation where they don't take active agency on any level, where it's basically your organisation comes in and saves the day, there's not a lot of empathy in that. I want to know how the protagonist worked, struggled to overcome odds. If you helped them in the process, yeah, that works. Okay, there must be a tangible goal within the story that the protagonist is striving to accomplish. And this is really, really useful for us because it helps us to define the boundaries of where the actual story we're telling sit. Biographical storytelling on any level can be cumbersome because which bit do you tell? Where does it start? Where does it end? Right? I'll look at this in further detail in a second. I'm going to take you through a piece of a fundraising video that I worked on, and we'll look at that in detail. For the resolution, how the protagonist feels at the end of the story, the residual resolution emotion, as it's called, determines how we feel and thus how we act. There's a really important thing here from Kendall Haven's research is they've found there are two general types of residual emotions, positive and negative. A happy feeling or a feeling of outrage, sadness. Negative resolution emotions are more likely to prompt action in an audience immediately. If I feel outraged at the end of the story, then I'm going to go click on something, sign the petition, do something. If I'm feeling positive, I'm less likely to act immediately, but what they're good for is they influence beliefs over time. If you're in a field where you're doing a lot of advocacy work, it's very important to share positive outcome stories because they won't get me to donate, they won't get me to do this, but over time they help me to reshape the way I see the issue that you're talking about, for any of you in the room who do that. And critically, details. Details are the language of story. And this is harder than you think. This is harder than you think, and people get it wrong all the time. I take people through exercises where I go, okay, spell out the picture for me in detail, take me into the scene, take me into the critical climactic moment. And what I get back is a bunch of conceptual statements and no detail and no images over and over and over again. It's an art form that humans innately had, but in our culture we've lost, I believe, because of broadcast media. Because audiovisual storytelling is really, really sophisticated and it does the imagining for us. And we have lost the art of oral storytelling, which is where I have to make a movie in your mind with the words that I choose. I would say to you, this is critical even if you're going, yeah, but we're going to make a video of the story. That's great. But if you do that and you haven't taken the time to figure out which are the emotional images of your story, then you are handing it over to a filmmaker to choose the images. And it's the images that do the work. You need to know what the powerful images of your story are before you bring the filmmaker in. So you can say, this is a story about this. The critical moment is this. We need you to capture that. Okay, so let's go into an example so you can see how I work with story in practical terms. I'm going to show you a video that I did a few years back for Sea Shepherd. One of the reasons that I do this is because we made it for nothing. It was a complete shoestring budget. They had a volunteer who was a filmmaker. We used entirely archival footage, and I worked pro bono on this piece, so I think in the end it costs a couple of $100 for getting it out through text message, etc. It was a donation drive. It was very successful. It doubled the donations for the previous year. Let's have a look at what we did. Now, this is the first template that I use with clients. It's essentially, it uses story stuff, but you would have seen it, used it in marketing, etc. Getting clear on who the audience is, demographics, psychographics, top of mind problems and concerns for your audience, values and beliefs. So we know who's the audience we're telling this story to. You'll see why in a moment. It has a lot to do with identity and empathy, those critical parts of storytelling. Getting very clear, what is the takeaway message that we want them to get? How do we want it to influence beliefs and attitudes? What do we want them to think? What do we want them to say to someone else? And what do we want them to do critically? So, for Sea Shepherd, basically here's what we got. We've got an audience 18 to 45 years old, well educated, informed about environmental issues. Why is this stuff important? Because it helps us know how much context do I need to give the story. With Sea Shepherd's donation audience, we know we can pretty much jump into the guts of it. They're pretty well informed about the issues. Culturally alternative, they're really against authority, they side with the underdog. The big issue and problem that we can speak to, what can I do about the exploitation and destruction of other species? Values and beliefs, respect for all living creatures and environment over profits. This is to do with identity and empathy. The values and beliefs are really key areas in which we're going to look for, will they identify and empathise with our protagonist? What's the message we want them to take away from the story? I have to act now to stop whaling. This audience already wants whaling to stop, but it's now. We want them to act now. What do you want them how to change? I have the power to do something now. What do you want them to think? You can see this is not rocket science. I need to donate to Sea Shepherd. Hey guys, watch this story, join me in donating. What do you want them to do? Click the link and donate. Yeah, keeping that in mind. And that's to do with how we frame the story too, what we use as a call to action. So let's have a look at it. So it's based on a piece of archival, a press conference that Paul Watson, the founder of Sea Shepherd, did years ago now. And we just used some archival footage to enhance the images. But you will see that he is already a very gifted oral storyteller. He's using very strong imagery. He's also a very conscious storyteller. He knows it's a very important part of his work.
I'd like to share with you a story about why I am so passionate about protecting whales. And because the reason I'm alive today is because a whale spared my life. And that was back in 1975. I was with Greenpeace at the time. I was first officer on the Greenpeace voyage. And we'd come up with this idea to save the whales by putting ourselves between the whales and the harpoons. Robert Hunter and I found ourselves in a small little inflatable boat in front of a 150-foot steel harpoon vessel bearing down on us at full speed in very rough water. And in front of us were 8 magnificent sperm whales that were fleeing for their life, and they couldn't get away from them. And every time the harpooner tried to get a shot, I would maneuver the boat and block his aim. And this worked for about 25 minutes. And a few moments later, there's this incredible explosion, and this harpoon flew over our heads and slammed into the backside of one of the whales. Suddenly, there was this scream. It hit one of the females in the pod, and she screamed. And suddenly, the largest whale in that pod slapped the water with his tail and disappeared. And he swam right up underneath of us, and he threw himself out of the water straight at the harpooner on the Soviet vessel to defend his pod. And they were waiting for them. They knew he would do that, and they had an unattached harpoon thrown into the cannon real quick. And at point blank range, he pulled the trigger and hit that whale in the head with this explosive tipped harpoon. And that whale screamed and fell back into the water, thrashing about in incredible agony on the surface in his own blood. And as his head rose up out of the water and I looked into his eye, an eye the size of my fist, it was right there, I saw something that changed my life forever. I saw understanding. He understood what we were trying to do. And in all his pain, I could see his muscles move, and he pulled himself back. And instead of coming forward to fall on top of us, he pulled himself back and he began to slide back into the sea, and I saw his eye disappear beneath the surface. And he died. He could have killed us, and he chose not to do so. And so that made me personally indebted to that whale for the fact that I'm alive.
Okay, so I'm going to look at the 5 elements of storytelling and how it relates to this. But firstly, if you go back to our influence potential equation and the 3 factors in there, we have the residual resolution emotion. What would you say is the feelings that the audience who empathises there are left with at the end of their...
Anger.
Anger, great.
Frustration.
Frustration.
Helplessness. Oh, not helplessness actually, because this is giving me something to do.
Outrage.
Outrage.
Sadness.
Sadness. So the anger and the outrage in particular are really activating emotions. This is the negative resolution emotion because we want a donation, and then we're using a call to action to channel that emotion into action. Critically, when we put up the donate now, because we understand how the images of the story are working, did anyone notice what image we put up visually behind the donate now? Subliminal, basically.
It's the fork, the pitchfork.
No, it wasn't.
Wasn't it the whale with the eye?
It's the eye of the
Yeah.
whale. Why? Because that image of the eye right there, the size of my fist, and I saw understanding is about the connection, right? So we put that up there at the moment to kick back in that emotion that you feel, understandably, when the whale is killed and sacrifices itself. The reason we're able to do that and get that effect is because we understand how the images are functioning in this story. How strong is the identification with the protagonist? I would say in this case from a values base, very strong. We'll look at that. Do we have a strong antagonist or foe character?
Yeah, a harpoon.
Yeah, the harpoonist or the whalers, the whaling vessel. Okay, so here we go. This is what I use to test a story, because as I said, stories are very slippery. It's very easy to lose track of where the story is and what does it do. This is the essential of a story. This is the story of Paul Watson, who was a courageous, daring, compassionate man. Those are qualities that we haven't had to say explicitly, that they come across in his telling of the story. He wanted to stop the whalers from killing the 8 whales. Concrete, specific goal. Not he wanted to end whaling. How, when, why. We are barracking for him to save those specific 8 whales. That's what keeps us in the moment of this story. Right? In order to attain it, he had to overcome a 150-foot steel harpoon ship bearing down on us in extremely rough waters. His language is really specific and really evocative. So he put himself between the harpoon and the whales. We even know it worked for about 20-25 minutes. He tells us that. Until finally the whalers shot the whale. It almost fell on him, but it spared his life and died. That's what happens in the end of the goal. Okay, we don't know about the rest of the whales from his story, but we can sort of assume there's a lot of death here, which made him feel grateful, indebted, determined, and outraged, I would say, although he doesn't express that, but we kind of imagine it in for him. From what we've looked at with our target audience, are we going to get empathy?
Yeah.
Very strongly. Does the message that I need to act now to stop whaling come across?
Yeah.
And are we going to get the action that we want, which is to click and donate?
Yeah.
Likely. And the outcome of the campaign showed us that it did work. But you can see why, right? Often we're looking at stories going, I like this story, or it feels emotional. I really hope it'll work for our donation drive, or to get people on board with the campaign. This is a way that you can look at it and you can analyse through and ask yourself the primary question, is this the right story, or should we be looking at another one? And secondly, are we telling this story in the right way? Are the right elements coming forth, or is it clouded with a bunch of information that's not as relevant, right? Have we missed out? Do we need to go back and re-interview someone because we're missing something in the story that's really going to kick in empathy?
I think the music was important too. It was,
Yeah.
it was up tempo. that really added because it engaged that part of
Absolutely. And I say if you're going to use audiovisual storytelling, find a really good filmmaker and someone who works beautifully with sound and editing and do it beautifully. But the reason I show you that is because we made it for peanuts. Why could we do it and have effect? Is because we had a great story at the heart of it. Right? A great story can be enhanced by the music, the visuals, etc. But if you don't have a great story at the core of it, you're not going to get the emotional impact and the action that you want. You'll get a nice piece of filmmaking, and that's great. But will people respond to it in the way you want them to? That's the other question.
How would you tell that story if it was a new audience? How would you tell that story differently?
If it was a new audience, it would probably need to be in a longer form.
What do you mean, an unaware audience of the whaling issue?
Completely new group, not you're preaching to the converted to some degree.
Yes. Yeah. Most of the time, I would say in donation drives, we are preaching to the converted.
Right? New audience.
If you're trying to get a new audience, this might not be the story to tell. Would be the first thing I would be looking at. And in fact, you'd want to go back to our audience sheet and look at that. Do we have someone in mind that we think could be converted? Is there a section of people who are not yet on top of this issue, but maybe they're into forest conservation or something? So we know. I'd be looking at that and going, right, there's probably going to be a different story to tell, which helps bridge the gap or brings them into the core of the issue. The story that we have here, even though we used it for a donation drive, is what I would call a founding story. It's a story that I don't know, but I would imagine Paul Watson has told a number of times, because it's the why I do what I do story. Founding stories can be more complicated for larger organisations or older organisations where you've lost touch, or you don't have still the person who was the driving force behind the starting of the organisation. But if you can get hold of and tell well a founding story, it's gold. Fred Hollows is a great example. Yeah, the founding story of Fred Hollows, they're still using it. And why? Because it's really powerful and people connect with it. And they tell it well too. It's often good to mine your archives if you're not telling a founding story and go, but it has to be a protagonist. It can't be the three people who got together to do it. It's too complex to tell. Right? You need to look at, all right, we make a choice. That can be difficult because of, organisational decision making, and there's a really strong push to go, yeah, but we're an organisation, everyone's important. Which I get, but from a storytelling point of view, no. Everyone is not important. One person is important, because that's who I empathise with as your listener. The other type of story that is more commonly used for donation drives, but also newsletters, all kinds of things, is what we call the beneficiary story, or I like to think of it as the story of the difference you make. The story of the individual who your organisation has helped. And just to flag, in storytelling in which your organisation plays a part, they play a part on the sidelines in effective storytelling. They take the part, generally, of a mentor character within the story. The protagonist will be the beneficiary of the story, the person who has the issue that they're struggling against. You position the organisation as coming in at just the right moment and doing the right thing that helps this brave individual to overcome their problem. We understand the mentor figure in storytelling. It's an old archetypal thing. It's like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. It's like the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz. If you look into classic traditional high storytelling, that mentor figure is in almost every story. That is the position that your organisation best occupies when you are telling the story of a beneficiary. You also don't have to overemphasise it because we understand it. You position yourself as a mentor, we get it, but because of you, it became a positive outcome. So we've got about half an hour and we can just throw it open to questions. You guys and keep it going unless there's something else you want to do with that time, Michael. Okay, question. Yeah.
I don't know, I don't want to take up too much time, so I know a lot of other people might have questions, but in terms of one protagonist, I'm a president of a committee of management in a kindergarten, and when I started that, I found that emails would go out that were very dull, and it was just, oh, please join the committee, we need money, and it was just very much. And so I took the decision myself that I would personalise it a bit. Yep. But then I ran the risk of alienating myself that, oh, who's she? She's talking on behalf of the committee. So that, it is difficult, as you say, that one person do
but
it.
let's not confuse overarching communication with storytelling.
Exactly. But I guess that's the thing of, in that situation where, okay, I might be the president, but there's a committee, how do you then
share around the glory?
Yeah, and also isolate so that people are going to, I guess, want to empathise and give money, and at the end result, is it just one child or is it all of the children? And I guess this is the thing, I've sort of tried to say, we've been raising money and look and give before and after pictures as well, and say, look, this is how bad the sandpit cover looked before, and look, after 3 years we've been able to do this, and make it more, rather than just please give us money because we need to replace stuff, because everyone needs to replace stuff. But how do you do that without, do you see what I'm saying, kind of making it just about one person? Or
so your communications are kind of,
it's
they're
difficult.
in the moment though, aren't they? Because what you're trying to do is get the parents who are there today to contribute today, not necessarily just have them see their contribution might be valuable in 5 years.
Yeah, because unfortunately things can take a long time.
Yeah, sure.
And also, I've been a parent there, both my kids have gone through, so I do try and say, look, I totally relate, I've seen my children thrive here, and I had doubts when they started, and la la la. But it's just, who's the protagonist? Is it the committee? Is it me? And then do you just isolate one child? Like, how do you kind of make that more effective? Because it's the sort of thing where
it's difficult to make hard and fast rules about this
I'm
stuff. It's it's about looking at, okay, what's the action you're wanting someone to take? As I've said, I would say this though, in terms of the notion of, oh well, why should I do something now when my kids will be out of here soon? One of the powers of storytelling is that it alters our experience of time. So the interesting thing, if you think back to the Sea Shepherd video, is Paul Watson's telling a story from when he was at Greenpeace. That's 15, 20 years ago, right? People are acting on that story now. They're seeing that as something they need to act on immediately now. All the whales in that pod died 20 years ago. There's nothing you can do for them. So you're acting from an abstract level to help other whales, but emotionally, you're trying to save the whale that fell on top of him. Do you see what's going on there? Yeah. This is one of the things about storytelling, is that our behaviour is not logical. Our behavioural response to stories is not based on a rational decision making, it is emotional, right? We then use our rational mind, and there's lots of psychological experiments that show this. Primarily our decision making is emotional, and then we use our rational mind to justify to ourselves the decision we took. And any time we talk to someone about why we took the decision, we'll tell them the rational reason we came up with, but we came up with that reason after we had already decided to act. If you are trying to convince people through information and through logical persuasion that they should act to do this, then you have to speak to logical reasons. And I would say you'll get some purchase with the right people. We know this. If you really want to look into the power of storytelling, then I would say if you don't have heaps of time and resource to go into it, choose a big drive, right? Go for something big. Find a story of a child for whom they were struggling with something in their life, and something about the kindergarten, something about something that went on there made a huge difference. So that I empathise with that child. It can be 5 years ago. So that what I come out with is the kindergarten being a really nurturing place for children is critically important, and I'm feeling it emotionally, and I want to act to support that now. You go beyond the immediate. The big stories historically that have influenced behaviours on massive scales are myths. They're not even true stories, right? But they have structured entire cultures and entire ways of behaving. The Bible dictated human behaviour throughout the European world for 2,000 years. It's a collection of stories. It's not rational. You know, fundamentalists will tell you it's rational, but fundamentally the way it's operating on the psyche is not rational. Right? So it's very important to me that we separate this out because it's soupy and it's difficult for us to see this. Human behaviour, I bring this home all the time, is emotional. It is emotional, not rational. It is very important, having said that in this kind of work we work with true stories. Or if you want to use a fable to illustrate a point, great, but tell us it's a fable up front. You tell us a story, we think it's real and we find out it's not, look out. You just lied to us because we feel duped because we empathised. Right? But you don't need to look very far in your organisations to find emotional stories that, when told well, can massively influence our behaviour.
Can I ask your advice when working with a really broad diversity of cultural groups with a whole range of literacy levels, but from very, very limited or low literacy levels through to quite competent? So I guess in terms of the messaging to communicate a story, what would you recommend in terms of the use of language that will connect on that greatest level?
What's the purpose of your storytelling?
So the purpose of the storytelling is, I guess, to mobilise people around a particular event or a campaign, to invite people to participate. So that would probably be the primary one I'd like to focus on, is how to invite people from...
But you're talking to a broad section of communities, and look, the interesting thing about story is that when I was learning performance storytelling, the master teacher I worked with used to say, a storyteller avoids Latin words. They use predominantly Anglo-Saxon words. This is when you're working in English. This is not a racist thing, it's just that the root words of English are Anglo-Saxon, and they're the simplest words. So when you're storytelling, from the get-go, use simple language. Don't overcomplicate the language. Overcomplicating the language is activating the rational parts of the brain, and if you overactivate them, they suppress emotion, right? And what we're wanting is the emotions, so you use simple language, and you can trust a lot in story structure. Have you ever seen a film or a play in a foreign language where there weren't subtitles? I've seen a lot, and I can tell you it's amazing how much you can follow. Ever seen Shakespeare, for goodness sake? It may as well be in a foreign language to most of us, right? But if the story is emotionally clear, we get it.
Can I make a point too?
Yeah.
You know, Joseph Campbell, who went and studied world myths, found that underpinning each culture were the same myths, essentially. Yeah, and you're already talking about telling a story using words. So, for example, if I can get into your imagination, if you've got an animation with a kid and a ball, and no words are spoken, and that kid can't get that ball or loses that ball, that'll make sense in every cultural language. So, in a way, starting with we're English, we're an agency in English, so we want to tell this story and we want to use English words, rather than exactly what you're saying, watching a film which has no words, that's the most powerful translator of story when you don't have to follow in any language.
Yes, that's very true, is that visual storytelling can be extraordinarily powerful to cross cultural boundaries.
And what's at the root of the same essential narratives in each culture?
And at the root, Joseph Campbell has the hero's journey model, which is very instructive, and Michael and I have geeked out on this a lot, and it underpins some work that we do. At the centre of that is this structure. That's in every story ever told. Why? Because it's here. So keep this in mind when you're telling stories, is that you are attempting to speak to the part of my brain that makes up stories. That's why this stuff is important. And in fact, one of the pieces of research that's really quite astonishing is that they found that when messages are structured in story structure, when you get all of this right, you get the right elements of story in the way that the brain does it itself, the message goes in without interpretation. Now, anyone who has a communications background is going, what? Really? Because fundamentally, a lot of the work in communications is, we've got to manage how people interpret the information. Story structure is the way we interpret information. So if you give me the message in a complete story, I don't have to interpret, so I don't. Why would I bother? I'm lazy. You give me information in a story structure, it goes in. Which is why this is so powerful, why DARPA is using this to analyse things around radicalisation. Tell a powerful story, it goes into the brain, it's very convincing. Use this power for good, not for evil, people. But this is at the core of it, paying attention to the way your story is structured. And generally, I will get it, even with language difficulties, which is why the 4-year-olds in my Orpheus audience could sit through stuff that I know intellectually they couldn't understand. It was too sophisticated for them. But the fundamental underlying dynamic of the story, they got it. If they didn't get it, they would have been moving around. Yeah? And I have seen that over and over. I've told stories a lot in schools, and I did one project for a year in which I was telling stories at schools where they had high Christian, Muslim and Jewish kind of cross populations. Telling stories particularly to a lot of young African kids who had recently immigrated, and so English, they were still learning it. I never had to dumb down the story, never, and I never would from my experience. They get it, they get it. And keep in mind that a lot of the way that we learn language as kids is listening to stories. If for those of you who are avid readers, you probably picked up half your vocabulary by reading books where there were words that were beyond your current knowledge, but given the context of the narrative, we make sense of it, and on we go.
My husband learned English watching Sesame Street. True story.
The makers of Sesame Street would be thrilled to hear that, because that was the purpose. Malcolm Gladwell has a fantastic episode on the backstory of the making of Sesame Street. Really interesting.
Simon, it's a loaded question because we've obviously talked a few things. But one of the things we keep talking about is organisations having a clear identity. How important is that when you start looking at storytelling from the perspective of who we are, what we're here to do, what impact we're trying to have? Because we often see that depending on who's putting pen to paper, the message can be slightly different, or the tone of the communication can be slightly different.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this in a new way as like, I do a show at the moment with the comedian Michael Veitch that we co-wrote, and it's set in a 1940s radio studio with old radio dramas. And one of the shows that we're doing is an old adapted Flash Gordon piece from the 1940s. And I've been thinking about the radio drama and the way it would come on a Sunday night, the whole family would gather around to hear this. The identity, I've been thinking of the organisational identity as like, you're the welcome storyteller. Because if I get your identity and I empathise and I identify with you, it's the same thing as when I go, Flash Gordon's on, I want to hear another story from Flash Gordon. Right? A whole lot of work is done straight away, so you can do shorter form storytelling. We can get past the getting to know you stuff. It's a familiar tone of voice, or when the storyteller would come to town in the village, begin the once upon a time in a long, long way. You were familiar with that voice, and it was like, in you go to the story trance. When I talk about transportation and the effect of the imagination, you are literally, with good storytelling, in any medium, putting your audience into a trance state. The state of consciousness alters. And I know this as a performance storyteller because people experience time discontinuity when my storytelling is going well. People will come out of Orpheus, which is an hour long almost exactly, and say, really, was that an hour? It just flew by. Or alternatively, they'll say, was that only an hour? I felt like I was in that world for years and years, right? It alters our perception of time because we leave this present moment and we go into an altered state of reality. The familiar storyteller's voice facilitates that. It just gives you that, oh goody, another story from my favourite uncle, or whatever it is, whatever that identity is. That's how I've been thinking about it anyway. And that identity is partly, I believe, built over the stories you share over time.
I'll jump in with another question, unless anyone else has one. Sure. I'm really interested in storytelling platforms, so the creation of, say, Humans of New York, and then the power that's taken on this amazing life where he started to address big social and political issues through the telling of very simple, short stories accompanied by an image. I guess, do you have any advice with how organisations could use a storytelling platform like that to communicate the stories of the people that we support and that we work with?
What I'm seeing is that the powerful work that's going on in storytelling now is where the person whose story it is, who owns the story, is empowered by the platform to tell the story themselves. Traditional fundraising is about finding someone with a story, taking the story from them, crafting it, and using the story. Now, sometimes that works really well and it's a positive outcome for everyone, but it also can go wrong. Increasingly, because of social media, we like to hear the story from the person whenever we can, because it's possible now in a way it didn't used to be possible. So this is the thing too, is now that, with tools like this that quantify how good storytelling works, the possibility now is you don't have to have someone who is trained in journalism to be able to tell a story well. And in fact, part of my work because I do a lot of work coaching in presentation and storytelling, is that I'm from an acting background. I did 4 years of training as a performer. And in terms of personal storytelling, I have actually had to undo a lot of my training, because the great thing about storytelling is we like authentic stories from real people. So if you're umming and ahhing a bit, or you have someone who's getting up, telling their story and they're clearly nervous, it's fine. If they drop a part of the story and go, and what I needed to tell you was this, you'll never see the audience go, oh, for goodness sakes, get it together. You get up and do a PowerPoint with graphs and data and you go, oh, hang on, the slides are out of order, and watch people going, oh God, here we go, right? As long as you are telling a story which is genuine, authentic and emotionally engaging, I will give you so much leeway. And in fact, I don't particularly like it when you're slick up there. Right? You know this yourself. If I got up and said, hi and welcome to the storytelling extravaganza, and I'm going to start with a story. It's 1986, right? You're all going, oh, 2 hours, help. This is the wonderful thing about the story structure, is that it's incredibly robust. When you find the right content and coach someone in how to simply, authentically tell their story, we give them so much leeway around doing it. TED Talks are a fantastic example of this. There's some really highly polished presenters in TED who are successful, but there's also people who are not presenters. They're just courageously sharing an authentic emotional story, and they're often the most shared, most responded to TED Talks.
Like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ken's from a performance background,
You can see him perform.
But the whole thing, that TED Talk is done off the cuff.
Yeah.
He knows basically what he's going to talk about, but he's a very natural storyteller.
And by the way, he's here this March.
I know.
If you want to learn a storyteller. And do you think he's a good storyteller?
I think he's a wonderful storyteller. Yeah. And partly because I know he's from he was a professor of drama, is that he's not up there telling a story to be a good storyteller. He's telling a story which has a critically important point. And to me, that's what makes a great storyteller. at its root is that you are communicating something that is clearly emotionally important to you and emotionally important to us. Yeah.
The moth people do amazing things too.
Yeah, The Moth, This American Life's great.
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell is a fantastic storyteller. For anyone who's needing to tell research stories, etc., look at the way Gladwell does it. He's a master of this stuff. Inviting us into quite complex stories. For those of you who are into historical storytelling, Dan Carlinson's Hardcore History is amazing. 6-hour podcast, just him talking.
What's his surname?
Carlin, C-A-R-L-I-N.
That's right, Carlin, not Carlinson. The podcasts are fabulous for examples of great storytelling out there. Yeah, on the way here, I drove from the Yarra Valley, and I'm grieving the fact that at the moment there's no new This American Life episodes for me to listen to, because that's often how that will keep me going on a long trip.